Chapter 8. Elizabeth groped for a light switch and stared around her. The secret room was a small book-lined study. Animal skins and heads adorned the walls, as in the dining room, but the dining room animals were from African safaris. The animals in this room were wolves leering down at her with their teeth bared. "The wolf's den," she whispered, spooked. The room was stuffy, but Elizabeth shivered. She caught sight of some of the titles of the leather-bound books, and her mouth dropped open. It seemed that every book in the room had something to do with werewolves. She suppressed a shudder. Lord Pembroke must be some kind of werewolf fanatic, she whispered, more because of the eeriness of the room than out of a fear of being discovered. How creepy. Then she remembered that Luke was also a serious student of werewolf lore. But, she told herself loyally, there was nothing creepy about Luke's fascination with the subject, not like Lord Pembroke's obsession. Collecting werewolf books and wolf heads and hiding them in a secret room was downright weird. Still, Elizabeth had to admit that Luke would love this place. She couldn't wait to tell him about it. For a moment, Elizabeth considered calling him. She eyed the telephone that sat on a small cluttered desk in the center of the room. Then she shook her head. Her time for searching for clues was too limited to spend it talking on the phone. She would tell Luke later. But she did notice that the phone number was not the one she had used to call Pembroke that morning. The werewolf room was so secret it even had its own telephone number. She wondered if that was to keep people from picking up other extensions in the house and hearing Pembroke's private conversations. Elizabeth turned to the crowded bookshelves and scanned the titles. Unlike the well-kept volumes in Lord Pembroke's main library, most of the books in the werewolf room were blanketed with a layer of dust. Obviously, not even the servants knew about this room. Elizabeth selected a beautifully bound volume, a 16th-century French work.
Quel discours de la lycanthropie?
Discourses on lycanthropy, she translated aloud. Before coming to England, she had never heard of lycanthropy. Now, she knew the term was used both for the study of werewolves and for the delusion that a person has turned into a wolf. The book fell open in Elizabeth's hands. She blew the fine powder from the title page and read an inscription written in graceful, elongated script. To Robert. With all my love, Annabel. The inscription was dated 20 years earlier, so Elizabeth knew the words had been written to the elder Lord Pembroke, rather than his son. But who is Annabel? She asked aloud. The inscription sounded as if it had been written by a lover, but certainly Lord and Lady Pembroke had been married at the time. Robert was 20 years old. But Lady Pembroke's first name was not Annabel. Elizabeth's imagination began to race. Had Lord Pembroke and Annabel had a tragic love affair 20 years earlier? Was that the scandal Eliana had mentioned? And where was Annabel now? For a moment, Elizabeth felt a twinge of sympathy for Lord Pembroke, but she pushed it aside, chastising herself for being too sentimental. She was here to solve a mystery and capture a killer, not to moon over a 20-year-old. Romancy. Elizabeth stared thoughtfully at the inscription. Could Annabel be the key to the mystery? She asked herself aloud. Elizabeth didn't know, but she was determined to find the answers. Earth to Lena and David, Emily called, waving her hand between her two friends' faces as a group of his residents sat on the front steps of the dormitory Tuesday evening. Stop gazing longingly into each other's eyes for a moment, will you? We have serious business to discuss. Eliana and David both blushed. You're both about as red as that double-decker bus that just passed by. Imaginary drumsticks. I suppose that means you had a pleasant afternoon. He winked at Renee. Eliana blushed again. So, Emily, what's this important business we have to discuss? We must determine what we're going to do tonight, of course. I'm as bored as a kangaroo in a body cast. How about it, Jessica? You're always a good one for ideas. Jessica shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. Where's Elizabeth tonight? David asked. Oops, Emily thought. Bad subject. Jessica grimaced. Miss Newspaper Reporter is out in the countryside for the evening, covering the story of the century. Farmer raises flamingos. Ostriches, Eliana corrected. Jessica stared at her. How did you know about that? Tony didn't approve the story until today. Eliana shrugged innocently. Elizabeth told me last night that she was going to ask Tony if she could write about them. Whatever. Jessica said airily. Then Jessica bit her lip sadly, and Emily realized that Jessica missed her twin sister, despite their argument. And I suppose Portia has a performance of a common man tonight, Renee said. That's right, Eliana said. So what shall the rest of us do with ourselves? Tonight? I don't think we want to sit here on the steps all evening, complaining about how bored we are. Emily snapped her fingers. I have an idea. I've heard about a posh comedy club in Soho. The admission's supposed to be a little pricey, but it'll be worth it. The place is called Kamikaze. That won't work, Eliana said offhandedly. Kamikaze is closed on Tuesdays. Emily stared at her, surprised that Lena would be so familiar with the fashionable London club. This wasn't the first time the working-class girl from Liverpool had revealed a surprising knowledge of London society. Emily noticed that David looked at Lena too, his face full of anxiety. How did you know that, Lena? Emily asked. Eliana blushed again. I suppose I must have read about it somewhere. Is anyone in the mood for a film? Renee asked. I don't think so, Jessica said glumly. There aren't many good movies out that I haven't seen, Emily said. I've got it, Gabriello said. A friend of mine is in a band that's playing at the Pink Zebra tonight. The Pink Zebra? David said. Sounds trendy. Emily grinned. It is. I've read about it in one of the tabloids. It's where the fashionable crowd goes when they feel a need for punking out. Even Jessica seemed to brighten. But Eliana shifted uncomfortably on the concrete step. I hope you have a wonderful time, she said, yawning. But I think I'll bow out and get to bed early. I'm a bit tired all of a sudden. Eliana jumped up from the step and disappeared into the dorm. What's with her? Emily asked. Just a few minutes ago she was as eager to go out as any of us. David sighed and shook his head. I don't know, he said, almost in a whisper. Sometimes I don't understand Lena at all. Elizabeth leaned over Lord Pembroke's ornately carved mahogany desk early on Wednesday morning. Her search of the library and werewolf room had been interrupted the day before when a servant came to dust the library. Elizabeth had barely made it out of the hidden room in time. She resolved to be more careful today. Elizabeth hadn't seen Lord Pembroke since her arrival the day before. She hoped he was still in bed that morning. Certainly Maria's murder had made Pembroke forget all about the interview he was supposed to have with Jessica today, but that was fine with Elizabeth. She thought she had a better chance of finding something useful if she could manage some uninterrupted time for sleuthing around Pembroke Manor. So far, Elizabeth's trip had been successful. The green robe was circumstantial evidence, but it did implicate Robert for Joy's murder. And the werewolf room was interesting, though Elizabeth wasn't sure how Lord Pembroke's obsession with werewolves tied into the murders. What did it mean? Had Lord Pembroke known all along that his son was a werewolf? Was his study of lycanthropy an effort to understand more about Robert's condition? No, she decided. The date on Annabelle's gift book proved that Pembroke had been interested in werewolves at least since the time of Robert's birth. So what did it all mean? Elizabeth sighed. Despite her discoveries, she still hadn't even found solid proof that the younger Robert Pembroke was a werewolf and a murderer. But time was running out. Her train would leave for London in a few hours. Annabelle, she said aloud, thinking of the inscription on the werewolf book. I don't know why, but I know she's important to all of this. Elizabeth slowly opened the top drawer of Pembroke's desk and immediately saw what she was looking for: an address book. Annabelle, she said again, thumbing through the pages as quickly as she could. Why couldn't Annabelle have signed her last name on her inscription, too? She laid the address book back in the drawer and sighed heavily. Of the entries that listed first names, not a single one mentioned an Annabelle. Then she turned and scrutinized the shelves until she saw what looked like a college yearbook. From the date on the spine, she guessed it was Pembroke's yearbook. Oxford, she said. Naturally. She flipped through the pages until she found his photograph. Lettered in crew and polo, she read. Debating Society, Dramatic Society, Hunt Club. Not much help there. Elizabeth leafed through the back section of the book, where several pages had been left blank for signatures. She scanned the pages for the elegant, elongated handwriting she had memorized from the inscription. In the werewolf book, there was no Annabelle. I guess I'll try the Wolf's Den one last time, she said under her breath, reaching for the copy of Jekyll and Hyde that she now knew would trigger the secret door. As her fingers grazed the volume, Elizabeth froze. She could hear Lord Pembroke's voice just outside the library doors. Elizabeth dove under the mahogany desk as Pembroke strolled into the room, followed by Andrew Thatcher. Then she clapped her hand over her mouth in consternation. The secret door had clicked open and was standing slightly ajar. If Pembroke or Thatcher noticed it, they would surely discover her. Yesterday's murder was the last straw, Thatcher said after he had closed the double doors behind them. Elizabeth noticed that the police chief looked thinner and more haggard than just a couple days earlier. Joy's death was apparently taking its toll on him. I know we agreed that the killer would be apprehended more quickly if we kept it out of the newspapers, and that due to your expertise you would, in a sense, carry on your own investigation. He ran his hand through his dark hair, making it stand on end. But I can't risk any more lives, Robert. We have to bring this monster in. My detectives at Scotland Yard are breathing down my neck. They suspect that you know more than you're telling, and I think so too. Pembroke began pacing. Elizabeth held her breath as he approached the secret door. She let it out, relieved, as he passed by the door without stopping. Just a little more time, Andrew, Pembroke pleaded. We've known each other since boyhood. Trust me for a few more days. You know that we're on to something big here, but we can't afford to play our hand too early. We can't afford to wait, Thatcher yelled. For people have died. How many more will it take? I know you have evidence of who it is. But Andrew, Pembroke argued. Don't try to deny it, Thatcher said. I've gone along with you until now. But no longer. I don't care how long we've been friends. Robert, I have to know what you know. Tell me who the evidence points to and hand over any clues you have regardless of who they implicate. Pembroke shook his head nervously. I don't think that's a good idea. The evidence I've found is misleading. It points to an innocent man. What evidence can he have? Elizabeth wondered, thinking of the large portrait of Robert on the wall. Does Lord Pembroke suspect Robert too? Then she cringed as he passed near the partially open door to the werewolf room. That's what police investigations are for, Thatcher said. You just hand over the evidence and let us decide if it warrants an arrest. Don't worry. We'll have to be bloody sure of the evidence before we accuse a man of being a werewolf. Elizabeth's eyes widened. Pembroke and Thatcher had known all along about the werewolf. But if I have all the evidence, Thatcher continued, I can put out a warrant for the suspect's arrest. Then we can question him and arrive at the truth of the matter. Pembroke sat down heavily in the desk chair, and Thatcher took over the pacing. Beneath the desk, Elizabeth scooted as far away from his knees as she could get, plastering her body against the opposite side. For a moment, Pembroke sat with his elbows on the mahogany surface, cradling his forehead in his hands. All right, he said reluctantly, his voice muffled. I'll turn over the evidence. But not right now. Let me talk to him first. He hesitated. Perhaps I can coax him to quietly turn himself in for questioning. Although, as I told you, I'm certain he's innocent. He pushed the chair out from the desk and turned to Thatcher. The police chief stopped pacing and stood with his arms folded directly in front of the door to the werewolf room. Elizabeth stiffened, willing the police chief not to turn around and see that the leather-covered panel was slightly open. I'll allow you until 10 o'clock tonight to give me the evidence, Thatcher said. But that's it. If you can convince your friend to turn himself in, then perhaps the law will go easier on him. But if you even think about changing your mind, Robert, remember that I can subpoena you to turn over any evidence you found. Pembroke nodded wordlessly. Our friendship is important to me, Robert, Thatcher said. But you know I could lose my job if anyone finds out I've been allowing you to withhold evidence. I understand, Andrew, and I appreciate your cooperation. You're a good friend. Thatcher strode across the room to the double doors of the library and then turned to face Pembroke again. Do me a favor, Robert, he said. Tell Reeves to ease up on the princess hype. It's making us look like we're not doing our job. After the police chief had left, Lord Pembroke stood in front of Robert's portrait. The evidence must be wrong, he said in a determined voice. My son is not a killer or a werewolf. I refuse to believe it. I'll clear your name, Robert, he vowed, eyes fierce with determination. I promise I will. Lord Pembroke stared up at his son's portrait, slowly shaking his head. Robert was innocent. Of that he had no doubt. Perhaps he was misinterpreting the evidence he'd found, the cigarette case from the Essex Street murder site and the green threads from Robert's silk bathrobe. Or perhaps someone else had planted the evidence in order to frame his son. But who would do such a thing? And why? The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't let the police arrest his son. Robert was no murderer. And Pembroke had promised himself years earlier that he would never let another scandal rock the Pembroke family name. I must warn Robert before I talk to Thatcher, he decided aloud. He must disappear for a bit, allow me time to find the real werewolf. He reached across the desk for the telephone, but then changed his mind. For this call he needed the complete privacy of his hidden room with its separate phone line. It would never do for a bumbling servant to happen upon him at an inopportune point in the conversation. Too many people are investigating this case already, he told himself, thinking about Jessica Wakefield's nosy sister scribbling in that notebook of hers. He would make the call from his secret study. Pembroke reached for the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to trigger the hidden door. Then he froze. The leather-covered panel was already open. That's odd, he said aloud, fighting down a feeling of panic. I'm certain I didn't leave that door ajar. But nobody else even knew of the existence of the wolf den, not even his wife. Annabelle is the only other soul who ever knew about this room, and that was years ago. He stood in the doorway and gazed around his private study. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed. In fact, he felt the same rush of emotion that always engulfed him upon entering the secret room, an odd mixture of security, mystery and passion. He and Annabelle had spent so many happy hours there, examining old documents and discovering new theories. But the concerns of the present were too disturbing to allow more than a moment of nostalgia. Somebody else had discovered his room. Perhaps one of the servants had pulled out Jekyll and Hyde while dusting, he told himself. He would have to investigate. After he called Robert, he closed the hidden door carefully behind him as he walked into the little room. Lord Pembroke had another mystery on his hands. As soon as Lord Pembroke disappeared into the secret study, Elizabeth jumped out from under the mahogany desk and raced from the library. She leaped up the stairs 2 at a time to reach the telephone in the hallway outside her room. The information she had just overheard couldn't wait. She had to call Luke right away and fill him in on everything she had learned. It was lucky that the telephone Lord Pembroke was using in the werewolf den was on a separate line. Elizabeth tapped her foot impatiently as the phone rang repeatedly on Luke's desk at the journal. Rats, she said aloud. Where could he be? She dialed Tony's number instead. I'm not completely certain where Luke is this morning, Liz, Tony replied to her urgent question. Out and about on an arts and entertainment scoop, no doubt. I've actually been able to get a lot of work done, with you and Luke out on your various stories, and Jessica spending the day with that young nobleman of hers. Elizabeth broke out in a cold sweat. Jessica is where? I assumed you knew, Tony said. She took a holiday today to spend some time with the young Lord Pembroke. She didn't mention where they would be going. Elizabeth's hands were trembling as she replaced the telephone receiver. Jessica was alone all day with a killer and probably a werewolf. Elizabeth knew she had to return to London immediately. She had to find Jessica before it was too late. Chapter 9. They think you're the werewolf, Lord Pembroke told his son over the phone. Wednesday morning. I know you're not, of course, but soon the situation will be out of my control. Robert's voice over the phone sounded impatient and a bit smug. I didn't think anything was out of the control of the Pembroke family. Besides, the police have no proof against me. They will soon, Pembroke replied ominously. Thatcher has threatened to subpoena me if I don't tell him everything I know by 10 o'clock tonight. I believe you're overreacting, Father. Overreacting? You don't seem to understand, Robert. The police will believe you are a serial killer and a werewolf. They'll put out a warrant for your arrest, and the newspapers will have a field day. There will be a horrible scandal, even if they determine there isn't enough evidence to bring you to trial. And what would you have me do, Father? We can't let Thatcher's people bring you in for questioning. I must clear your name. How do you propose to do that? I probably know more about werewolves than any living person in England. Anyone can track down the real werewolf I can. Until then I want you to disappear for a few days. Get out of town this morning now. I'm afraid that's not possible. I have plans for this morning.
Change
your plans, Pembroke interrupted. I'll get word to you when it's safe to return. All right, father, if you insist. But I can't depart immediately, father. Plan to meet somebody shortly and our appointment is even more crucial. Now that I know the police will be after me soon, I'll leave town as soon as I've finished. Jessica jumped into the passenger seat of Robert's silver Jaguar. Why's the top up? She asked after kissing him good morning. The London weather is actually cooperating for a change. What's the use of having a convertible if you can't take advantage of a little good weather? How are you this morning, Jessica? Robert asked formally. Jessica looked at Robert curiously. He seemed awfully distracted. His eyes hadn't even lingered on the outfit she'd chosen especially for the occasion, a short, breezy dress that showed off her shoulders and exactly matched the turquoise color of her eyes. Well, Jessica knew the cure for a distracted boyfriend. A little bit of bright chatter would cheer him up right away, especially when combined with the prospect of spending the day together out in the country, just the two of them. She was confident that he would notice her outfit in no time. I'm so relieved to have the day off from that boring newspaper, Jessica exclaimed. Yesterday's story, the case of the clog robber, just about did me in. You don't know how much I've been looking forward to our trip to Stonehenge today. Robert sighed, keeping his eyes focused on the road ahead of him.
I'm afraid
there's been a change of plans, he said. Let's go to the Connaught, shall we? I'll fill you in over breakfast. Jessica felt her heart sinking. She rode the rest of the way in silence. Jessica poked her fork at the uneaten eggs Benedict on her plate. She couldn't believe that Robert was canceling their date and that he was leaving town. But where are you going? She asked. How long will you be gone? I don't know, Robert said, reaching across the table to take her hand. But you'll have to look out for yourself until I return. Unfortunately, I may not be able to contact you. Why not? Robert ignored her question. Don't worry. As soon as I get back, I'll find you. Get back from where? I can't tell you that. Just promise me you'll be careful while I'm away. Jessica looked into his eyes and saw an intensity there that frightened her. Robert, none of this makes any sense. It's bad enough that my sister's turned into a basket case. Now you're getting all paranoid on me, too. Robert shook his head. It's not like that, Jessica. But I can't go into the particulars. Are you in some kind of trouble? Let me help you. There's nothing you can do, he told her. Just promise me you'll be careful. Jessica shrugged, unable to resist his intense gaze. All right, Robert. I'll be careful. Is everyone in England crazy? She wondered, remembering a snatch of an old song about mad dogs and Englishmen. Robert glanced at his expensive watch. I'm in a terrible hurry, Jessica. Here's enough money to pay the breakfast bill and to take a cab anywhere in the city that you want to go. If anyone asks, tell them you didn't see me this morning. He tossed a few notes on the table in front of her and kissed her with an urgency that was disturbing, almost frightening. Then Jessica watched sadly as Robert, the only guy she'd loved since Sam's untimely death, hurried away from her. Elizabeth practically leapt off the train as soon as it pulled into Victoria Station. The customary procedure, miss, said an amused porter, is to wait until the train has stopped before disembarking. Elizabeth barely heard him as she ran toward a bank of telephones, all of which were in use. She shifted anxiously from one foot to the other as she waited for one of the callers to finish up. My sister is in terrible danger. She wanted to scream. Please let me use the phone. Elizabeth blamed herself. It was true that she had tried to warn her sister about the Pembrokes. Jessica wouldn't pay attention, but she should have tried harder. She wished she had been able to get hold of Luke at the Journal that morning. Maybe he was back from his assignment by now. Maybe he's seen Jessica, or knows where Robert was taking her. Thank goodness for Luke, Elizabeth said under her breath. I could never handle this alone. A minute later, she was on the phone with Tony at the newspaper. Sorry, Liz. Luke isn't back yet. How are your ostrich friends? Huh. You know the ostriches. The story you traveled all that distance for. Oh, fine, Tony. What about Jessica? Have you heard anything from her? Well, no, Liz. But she's on a date with her beau. I hardly would expect her to check in with me. Is something wrong? You sound rather distraught. After she hung up the phone, Elizabeth stood for a moment with her hand on the receiver, contemplating her next move. The police, she said aloud. Her sister was with a murderer. Obviously she should call the police. She lifted the receiver but quickly dropped it. Andrew Thatcher was the only person on the police force who would believe her story, and he hadn't returned to London yet. She could just imagine herself saying to anyone else on the police force, "Excuse me, officer, but I need your help. My sister's in terrible danger. You see, she has this date with a werewolf." No, the police weren't an option. With Luke unreachable, she would have to rescue Jessica all by herself. But first she had to find her. When the going gets tough, the tough go shopping, Jessica said aloud, standing in front of Harrods as her taxicab pulled away from the curb. She still couldn't believe Robert had cancelled their excursion to Stonehenge. She had been eager to spend some time alone with him, far away from the distractions of the city and the prying eyes of her nosy sister. Even more disturbing was Robert's evasiveness. Why was he leaving town so suddenly? Where was he going? And why couldn't he answer any of her questions? For a moment she wondered if Robert could be some sort of secret agent on a dangerous mission. Nah, she decided, dismissing the notion almost as soon as it occurred to her. The idea appealed to her sense of adventure, but it was almost as far-fetched as Elizabeth's fears about werewolves. At least one. Wakefield had to hang on to her senses. To make matters worse, the clear sky of early morning was now shrouded in gray storm clouds. It looked as if it would rain again after all. Well, Jessica had always prided herself on her resourcefulness. She hadn't had a minute to hit Harrods since she'd arrived in London thanks to her stupid internship at the Journal. Now was her chance. And Robert had made the opportunity even more tempting by leaving her with a little money to spare. After she had covered the restaurant bill and cab fare, Jessica pushed open the door of Harrods solemnly, as if she were entering a temple. She sighed, feeling lonely for the first time since she'd arrived in England. "Lila Fowler, where are you when I need you?" Immediately, Jessica was drawn, as if by a magnet, to a department full of high-class European fashions. A black and white culotte set beckoned from the rack. If shopping wouldn't cheer her up, nothing would. "I'm looking for a 16-year-old blonde girl," Elizabeth began frantically. "Speaking with a street vendor that afternoon, just outside of Kensington Gardens." "Aren't we all?" the college-age boy replied with a sardonic grin. "She looks just like me." The vendor took in her size 6 figure and long golden hair. "This is sounding better and better," he said with a wink. Elizabeth stifled the urge to slap him. Instead, she turned and ran into the gardens. Ever since Elizabeth had gotten off the train at Victoria Station, she had been racking her brain to think of places Jessica wanted to see in London but hadn't been to yet. Where in London would Robert and Jessica go on their date? Elizabeth's first stop had been Bond Street, to see if her sister was window shopping at any of the high-class stores. Jessica and Robert could even be doing some real shopping, Elizabeth realized, remembering the size of Robert's family fortune. Jessica would be thrilled to bring back a souvenir worthy of anything Lila Fowler owned. But the store clerks Elizabeth spoke to hadn't seen Jessica and Robert. If Jessica had succumbed to her addiction for buying clothes she couldn't afford, she hadn't done it on Bond Street. Now Elizabeth was in the biggest park in the city, and a park with a palace in to boot. And Elizabeth realized it was a perfect place for a romantic stroll. She hurried along the garden path, peering down the long rows of sculpted shrubberies that branched off to both sides. It was a weekday, so the gardens weren't crowded. She could just imagine Jessica and Robert walking hand in hand between the manicured hedges, in a secluded part of the park. When suddenly Robert turned to Jessica, and blood dripped from his fangs. "Stop it," Elizabeth said to herself aloud. A woman pushing a baby stroller looked at her curiously and steered a wide path around her. Elizabeth took a deep breath and wrenched her mind away from dramatic images of Jessica in danger. "I have to be calm and objective," she told herself, under her breath. She wished Luke were there, but she had called the newspaper again from Bond Street, and he still hadn't returned from his assignment. She would try again soon, but for now she was still on her own for finding Jessica if it wasn't already too late. She noticed Kensington Palace up ahead and remembered how eager Jessica had been to visit it. Several members of the royal family were living in Kensington Palace, but parts of it were open for tours. Elizabeth was sure the royals wouldn't hang out with the tourists, but it would be just like Jessica to expect to see a princess, or tour better yet, a prince. Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of irony. Won't Jessica be surprised to learn she's been sharing a room with a real-life princess all this time? She prayed that her sister would live long enough to hear all about it. You look as if you're attempting to buy out the whole store, a young sales clerk exclaimed as Jessica lugged her shopping bags to a checkout counter. In Harrods, clutching a lovely silk scarf that would go perfectly with the chic purple mini dress she'd bought a few minutes earlier. I guess I am on a serious power shopping binge, Jessica replied. I'm trying to drown my troubles in store receipts. Once again, she handed the clerk the credit card the twins' parents had given them for this trip in case of emergency. If this wasn't an emergency, Jessica didn't know what was. Within the first half hour, she'd spent the rest of the money Robert had left. Since then, she'd been working on the credit card and hoping she hadn't reached its limit. Besides buying overpriced European clothes, Jessica reflected while the clerk rang up the scarf. Her only consolation was that Elizabeth must be back in town by now. Maybe she's getting stuck with the latest bumpo scoop while I have the day off. Jessica's attention was caught by a display of Italian shoes. She sighed, knowing she was probably about to pay twice as much money as she would ever consider spending on a pair of shoes back home. But the medium-height heels with the violet panels of lizard-look leather would be perfect with her new mini dress. Suddenly, Jessica felt a prickling at the back of her neck. She had the distinct feeling that someone was watching her. For an instant she plainly heard Robert's voice. Promise me you'll be careful. Jessica turned slowly, pretending to be engrossed in the shoe display while she peered out of the corner of her eye. Nobody was there. It was just some nosy salesperson spying on me, she speculated under her breath. It's because I'm an American teenager trying on everything in the store. Suddenly, Jessica was swept by a wave of depression. Even the shopping binge, usually one of her favorite activities, was leaving her feeling strangely empty. She reviewed her mental list of whom she was mad at. She was ticked off at Elizabeth for interfering with her relationship with Robert. She was ticked off at Tony Frank for not letting her work on exciting, glamorous stories at the Journal. She was ticked off at the nasty English weather that stayed gray and rainy practically all the time. And she was ticked off at her parents for not being rich enough so that she could actually afford all the stuff she was buying. Most of all, Jessica was ticked off at Robert for standing her up that morning and not explaining why. Nobody did that to Jessica Wakefield and got away with. But Robert was getting away with it, and that made her ticked off with herself for loving him so much that she would let him do this to her. He's hiding something from me, Jessica whispered. And I don't like it one bit. What do you do when someone you care about is hiding something from you? David asked Portia as the two walked toward his Wednesday afternoon. He was obviously trying to keep his voice sounding casual, but Portia could tell he was quite upset. The two teenagers had run into each other on their way home. David was finished with classes for the day. Portia had come from a matinee performance of A Common Man and had several hours to rest before the evening show. When you love somebody, you're supposed to be honest with them, David continued. But Lena is hiding something from me, and I don't know what it is. She claims to be from Liverpool, but she changes the subject every time I bring it up, as if she's ashamed of it. And sometimes she says the oddest things, as if she's lived a very different life from the one I would imagine. There's something strange in her past, Portia, but she won't confide in me at all. Maybe she doesn't really care about me after all. Sometimes people keep secrets from one another because they do care, Portia said slowly. She was talking about Lena, but it was her father's image that popped into her mind. If Lena is hiding something, maybe it's because she's afraid you wouldn't approve if you knew the truth. Just like my father wouldn't approve if he knew I was appearing in a play. But it would be better to know the truth, David argued. If you really love someone, then finding out their secrets wouldn't change that. Wouldn't that depend on the secret? Portia asked. David walked silently for a few yards. I suppose so, he said. But I think I deserve to know what Lena is hiding from me, no matter what it does to our relationship. She can't go on being dishonest with me or the relationship. Doesn't stand a chance anyhow. If Lena is hiding something important, then I suspect she can't go on that way much longer, Portia said, realizing she was speaking about herself as, well, a person can't hide behind a lie forever. The truth has a way of coming out eventually. So why doesn't she just tell me herself? Perhaps she wants to tell you, but doesn't know how to broach the subject. Well, she'd better find a way, David said, pausing as they reached the front steps of the dormitory. I love Lena, but I don't know how much longer I can continue in a relationship that's based on dishonesty. If you really love her, you should try to be patient with her, Portia urged. But I suppose you're right. She can't hide from you forever, just as I can't hide from my father forever. I don't know if I've been of any help with your problem, David, but you've certainly helped me with mine. I've decided to find a way to tell Sir Montfort Albert who Penelope Abbott really is, and I'm going to do it soon while my father is in town this week. But I haven't the foggiest idea how. The Knightsbridge tube station seemed strangely quiet as Jessica descended deeper and deeper underground. Of course it wasn't yet rush hour, but Jessica was still surprised at the lack of activity on a Wednesday afternoon. She maneuvered her bulky Harrods packages through the turnstiles. She glanced down at the well-stuffed shopping bags. She felt a twinge of guilt about her high-priced shopping overdose. No way, she said under her breath. I refuse to feel guilty about shopping. Robert abandoned me this morning. I deserve to have a fun day. Then she sighed miserably, realizing that her day of shopping hadn't been the least bit fun. Jessica walked along the yellow-tiled corridors to the train platform, listening to the echo of her footsteps through the dim, empty station. The platform was deserted. Jessica suppressed a shudder. The shadowy stillness made it easy to imagine that she was buried alive. The silence seemed to wait, holding its breath. Jessica held her breath too. If I were skittish, she thought, I'd call this eerie. Elizabeth would probably call it eerie. But Elizabeth had turned into a paranoid chicken. After hearing a few of Luke's werewolf stories, Jessica was not paranoid. She forced herself to breathe normally, refusing to be scared by the fact that it was utterly silent in the cold, damp underground. Dead silent. Suddenly Jessica froze. A strange noise was coming out of the dark tunnel. It was a heavy, panting sound, definitely not the subway train. And it was coming faster. Jessica's eyes widened. She certainly wasn't going to wait around on the deserted platform to see if it was coming for her. She took off, running full speed down the platform with her shopping bags bumping uncomfortably around her legs. She had to get away from the panting, away from something that was coming faster and faster out of the shadows. In a panic, she realized that the creature was rapidly catching up with her. She couldn't outrun it. The panting was directly behind her. Jessica felt the creature's hot breath on the back of her neck. Then she tripped and fell to the cold tile floor. Chapter 10. As Elizabeth raced through the door of the newspaper office on Wednesday afternoon, she plowed straight into Tony Frank on his way out of the building. In a rush. Sorry, Tony, she said breathlessly, as she helped him retrieve the notebook and tape recorder he dropped when she ran into him. But I'm glad I caught you. I have to talk to you. It's urgent. Not now, Elizabeth, he said brusquely. Henry Reeves just informed me that a body was found at Pembroke Manor yesterday morning. There's no telling why the police didn't release the information yesterday, not to mention Lord Pembroke himself. But I must head out there now to investigate. Elizabeth opened her mouth to tell him Jessica's life was in danger, but Tony kept talking in a frantic tumble of words. It's a nasty business, all right, he said. Henry heard a rumor that the dead woman might be Princess Eliana. So, as you can imagine, I've no time for Esha. Henry insisted that I write up a story based on that rumor, so I have. But it would never do to run it in tonight's edition until it's substantiated. And nobody is willing to tell me anything over the phone. He pushed past her and was about to rush out of the building, but Elizabeth's next words brought him to a halt. It's not the princess. Elizabeth's voice held such certainty that Tony turned to stare at her. It's not the princess, Elizabeth said again, feeling tears of frustration in her eyes. She was frantic about Jessica, and Tony was the only person she could turn to. I don't understand, he said. How do you know it's not the princess? Elizabeth almost blurted out the whole story, because the princess is living in my dorm room and working in a soup kitchen. But she stopped herself in time to keep Eliana's secret safe. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I was at Pembroke Manor yesterday morning when the body was carried out of the house. The dead woman is definitely not Princess Eliana. It's Maria Finch, the Pembroke's cook. Please don't go, Tony. I've got to talk to you right now. It's about that murder and another murder that could take place today if we don't stop it. Tony stared at Elizabeth for a moment, taking in her wide eyes and tense posture. All right, he said quietly, leading her back into his office. Let's hear what you have to say. Jessica sprawled face down on the cold floor of the subway platform, her fingers clenched around the handles of her forgotten shopping bags. Directly above her, something snarled. To Jessica, the noise seemed to echo off the vaulted ceilings, filling the deserted tunnels with terror and loathing. Jessica tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't obey, as if she were paralyzed by fear and a nightmare that was terrifyingly real. The floor felt as cold as a tomb. Something hairy brushed against the back of Jessica's arm. She stifled a scream. It was Elizabeth's werewolf. It had to be. Jessica began to tremble. Hot breath seemed to singe the hairs on the back of her neck as the creature leaned over her. The panting filled her ears like a sky full of thunder. Then Jessica heard something else. Loud voices bounced off the walls of the corridors, coming closer. The heavy panting quieted to a low rumble, as if her attacker had stopped to listen. It's as if the firm were giving executives free lobotomies as a fringe benefit. A man's voice boomed from a nearby corridor. A woman's voice responded. Before they made her a vice president, Wanda was as reasonable as any of us. Then the hairy creature was gone. Through the pounding of her own pulse, Jessica vaguely heard it running away, down the empty platform. For a moment Jessica was too scared to move. Then she picked herself and her shopping bags off the floor and dusted off her clothes. She was still alive. It hadn't gotten her. Jessica stared around her wildly as she fought to catch her breath. Nobody. And no thing was in sight. The hairy creature must have been swallowed up by the murkiness of the train tunnel. She jumped at a harsh burst of laughter coming from behind her. But it was only a group of business people in long raincoats, emerging onto the other end of the platform from the yellow-tiled corridor. The booming voice came from a tall man in a black bowler hat, who was loudly regaling the others with another anecdote about the new executive, Wanda. Jessica wanted to ask the group for help, but she knew that her story would sound preposterous. A big hairy thing attacked me on the tube platform. Must be the werewolf my sister's been looking for. Instead, she shook her head and sighed loudly. Under her breath, she thanked the man with the bowler hat and the booming voice for showing up when he did. He would never know it, but he had just saved her life. Jessica's feud with her sister suddenly seemed unimportant. I'll go to the newspaper office, she decided in a whisper, praying that Elizabeth and Luke would be there. They're the werewolf hunters. They'll know what to do. But the tube station was giving Jessica the creeps, after her encounter with her hairy assailant. She didn't think she could bear to wait there on the platform for the train. She would take a taxi instead. Besides, it would be faster. She clumsily shifted a shopping bag from one hand to the other to check her purse for the cab fare. Darn, she said aloud, causing the man in the bowler hat to turn for a moment to look at her. Not only had her shopping spree topped the credit limit on her card, but it had also taken every last pence in her wallet. Jessica had no choice now. She would have to wait for the subway. She edged closer to the cluster of people in raincoats, not daring to peer again into the depths of the murky train tunnel where she knew the hairy creature had disappeared. But when she turned away from the tunnel, Jessica was gripped by terror. She imagined she still heard the panting behind her, and felt a pair of savage eyes boring hungrily into her back. You know, David really cares about you, Portia said to Eliana as the two girls sat down to tea in the dining room of his on Wednesday. But he's upset. He thinks you don't trust him. I do trust David, Eliana said. At least I think I do. It's none of my business, Lena, but I hate to see a nice fellow like David get hurt. Besides, I think you love him too. When you feel that way about someone, you should be honest with him. Eliana's eyes glistened with sudden tears. But what if David stops loving me? When he knows what I really am? Portia was mystified. What terrible secret can sweet, simple Lena be hiding? David's not like that, Lena, she said gently. You have to trust in his love for you, and let him know the truth whatever it is. I could say the same thing about you and your father, Eliana reminded her. Portia sighed. My father doesn't care about the real me. He's made up his mind that I shouldn't be an actress, and that's that. He's so overprotective. I wish he would let me try myself, so I can succeed or fail on my own merits. Eliana nodded her head. I know what that's like. My mother is the queen of overprotection. She smiled enigmatically. She barely lets me out of the house. That seems a bit extreme, Portia agreed. I guess it started when I was a baby, Eliana explained. I was sick a lot, and I almost died once. So Mum's always been rather protective of me. To make matters worse, Glor, my older sister, was kind of a swinger at my age. Suppose Mum's afraid I would be the same way if given the chance, even though my sister and I are nothing alike. I just wish she would trust me to make my own decisions. Mrs. Bates bustled into the room. Can I freshen your tea, Portia dear? She asked, hovering over her. No, thank you, Mrs. Bates, Portia told her politely, annoyed at the interruption. I'll have some, Eliana began, but the dorm mother didn't seem to hear her. Tell me, Portia, have you heard from your father lately? Did I tell you I saw him last year in King Lear? Yes, you did, as a matter of fact, Portia began, but the dorm mother kept talking. Sir Montfort Albert. Now there's a fine figure of a man. Portia dear, can I get you anything else to eat? I've got some lovely crumpets in the kitchen. No thank you, Portia said, rolling her eyes at Eliana. As soon as the door closed behind Mrs. Bates, Portia exploded. I hate that, she exclaimed. Why do people treat you differently when they know you're upper class? Whatever that means. You know, that's one of the things I like about being Penelope Abbott. I want people to judge me by my actions, not my lineage. She sighed. You don't know how lucky you are to be a normal person. But I guess that's hard for you to understand. Eliana was staring at her intensely. No, it's not, she said fervently. I know exactly what you're talking about. Then she softened her tone. I mean, I notice the way Mrs. Bates and people like her act around you. I wish I didn't come from a famous family. But Portia, Eliana began slowly, as if she was just coming to a new realization. Your lineage is part of you too. More and more I see that you can't hide who you really are. A person who really cares should accept you for the real you, all of you. So, are you going to trust David with the real you? Yes, Eliana decided. Then she smiled a little wistfully. As soon as I can. Get up the nerve. Are you going to trust your father with the real Penelope Abbott? Yes, Portia said, suddenly knowing exactly how to tell her father the truth about her. And I'm going to do it today. I'm sending him tickets to tonight's performance of A Common Man. He's already judged me as his daughter. Now I want him to judge me as an actress. Tony ushered Elizabeth into his office that afternoon and closed the door. Elizabeth whirled to face him. Has Jessica called in since the last time I talked to you? Tony shook his head impatiently. You said you had urgent information about the murder, Liz. Do we have to waste time discussing your sister's social calendar? Elizabeth began pacing across the small office, terrified that Tony wouldn't believe her story. This is about the murder, she said, her voice rising. I think Jessica might be the next victim. We have to find her. Whoa, let's start at the beginning, shall we? Tell me what you know about the murder and why you think Jessica is in danger. But first, stop that infernal pacing. You're making me dizzy. Elizabeth perched nervously on the edge of his desk and told him about her investigation, beginning with eavesdropping outside the window of Cameron Neville's house more than a week earlier, and ending with Lord Pembroke's conversation in the library that morning. A few minutes after she started, Luke walked into the office, looking for her. Elizabeth pecked him on the cheek gratefully, feeling her confidence returning. She filled him in on everything she had seen and heard since their last conversation, with the exception of the mysterious Annabel, who had signed Lord Pembroke's book. With all my love. Elizabeth still had no evidence that Annabel was connected to the murders, except her own gut feeling. She decided she would tell Luke about the inscription later, when Tony wasn't around. Well, I can't say that I believe the murderer is an actual werewolf, Tony said at last. Though I know that the elder Lord Pembroke has been a bit of a werewolf hobbyist for years. But it does sound as if you could make a murder case against young Robert Pembroke if he's still in town. But Liz, I still don't understand about the cook's murder yesterday. You say Pembroke was there. Why didn't he inform the newspaper? Did he actually believe we wouldn't find out? I don't know what he believed, but he seemed panicky when they carried the body out yesterday as if he wasn't thinking straight. And he specifically warned me not to tell anyone at the Journal about the murder. Tony stared at her curiously. So why are you telling me now? How do you know? I'm not in league with Pembroke to cover up the murder stories. He looked down at his shoes. Lucy Friday seems to believe I am. Elizabeth shrugged. I know we can trust you, she said.
Besides, I'm afraid.
For Jessica. I never would have stayed at Pembroke Manor if I'd known she was spending the day alone with Robert. He's a werewolf and a serial murderer. Anything happens to Jessica, it will be all my fault. Luke put a hand on her shoulder. Nonsense, Liz. Until you overheard Pembroke and Thatcher this morning, you had no solid evidence that Robert could be dangerous. You can't blame yourself. Actually, Tony said, I'd like to bring this to Lucy. She's angry at me, of course, but I'm sure we can put our squabbles aside for something this important. She was certain that the newspaper was intentionally covering up the earlier murders, and she's a more experienced investigator than any of us. I'd like to hear her take on what you've just told me. More talking? Elizabeth asked, jumping from her seat. Why are we wasting time talking? We've got to find Jessica. As she spoke, the door behind her opened. You found her, Jessica announced from the doorway. Elizabeth whirled in time to see an unwieldy load of shopping bags thud to the floor around her sister. Thank goodness you're all right, Jessica, she exclaimed. I thought you were in danger. Suddenly, she noticed her sister's sweat-streaked face and disheveled hair. Jessica's bare-shouldered turquoise dress was smudged with dirt. But the most disturbing thing of all was the terrified look in Jessica's blue-green eyes. You were right, Liz, Jessica began breathlessly. It's after me. It attacked me in the Knightsbridge tube station. It chased me from behind. It was getting closer. Then I fell flat on my face, and I could feel it leaning over me. What attacked you? Tony asked, disturbed. Jessica shook her head. I'm not sure. It was big, at least it was bigger than me. And it made an awful kind of panting, growling, snarly noise. She shuddered visibly. I was wrong, Liz, she said. I never dreamed I'd be saying this, but I am starting to believe in werewolves. Whatever attacked me was pretty. Chapter 11. Jessica settled gratefully into the overstuffed couch in Lucy's flat. It was only mid-afternoon Wednesday, but it had been a long, terrible day, and Jessica was exhausted. Lucy rolled the green silk threads between her fingers. So you found these in the door frame of the room where Joy Singleton was killed? Elizabeth nodded. With the piece of fur. Do you know where the threads come from? Elizabeth nodded again, more nervously this time. She glanced over at Jessica, bit her lip, and unfolded a large piece of fabric from her backpack, the green paisley silk bathrobe. Jessica gasped. That belongs to Robert. What are you doing with it? It looks like an exact match for the pieces of fiber I found in the door frame, Elizabeth explained, handing the robe to Lucy. Where did you get Robert's robe? Jessica asked suspiciously. I took it from his closet at Pembroke Manor last night. Jessica jumped up from the couch. What were you doing at Pembroke Manor last night? And why were you snooping through Robert's stuff? I swear, Elizabeth, just because you don't like Robert is no reason. Please, Jessica, Lucy interrupted, smoothly but forcefully. I'd like to hear what Elizabeth has to say. Jessica scowled at Elizabeth, but sat down quietly. When Lucy spoke in that commanding tone, it was hard not to obey. Besides, Lucy was one of the few people here whom Jessica had sincere respect for. Lucy wasn't afraid of anything. We all know that the newspaper has been covering up details of the recent murders, and that there are some similarities between the deaths. Elizabeth began. Luke and I had narrowed down the possible murder suspects to 3 people: Lord Pembroke, Lady Pembroke, and the younger Robert Pembroke. Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but closed it when Lucy raised a warning hand. So I went to Pembroke Manor yesterday to find evidence that would implicate one of them, Elizabeth continued. I thought you were writing about ostriches. Jessica interrupted. The ostriches were a ruse, Elizabeth admitted. I only used them as an excuse to get out of town. Lucy looked perplexed. What is this about ostriches? Tony waved his hand. Never mind that part right now. It's not important. Have you found any other evidence of young Robert's guilt? Lucy asked. Jessica tried to speak again, but Elizabeth cut her off. Yes, she said. And I know Lord Pembroke has evidence of it as well. Overheard a conversation between Pembroke and Andrew Thatcher. Thatcher knows. Pembroke is protecting somebody. Apparently, Thatcher let him get away with it. Up until now, but Thatcher said the latest murder was the last straw. He gave Pembroke until 10 o'clock tonight to tell him who the murderer is or he'll subpoena him. So you never actually heard Robert's father say that Robert is a murderer? Jessica said triumphantly. Actually I did. Well, sort of. After Thatcher left, Robert's father said that the evidence he's found clearly implicates Robert, but that he doesn't believe it. He decided to call Robert and tell him to get out of town. Jessica felt the color drain from her face. That explained Robert's sudden flight from London, and his evasiveness at breakfast that morning. That doesn't mean anything, Jessica cried. It doesn't prove that Robert is a murderer, much less a werewolf. Lucy raised her eyebrows. A werewolf? You kids think the murderer is a werewolf. What kind of a cockamamie story is that? It's true, Luke said quietly, his blue eyes blazing. And it's not just us who think so. Even Pembroke and Thatcher believe it, if what Elizabeth heard this morning is any indication. Elizabeth shrugged. I know it sounds crazy, but look at the evidence. The victims' throats were ripped out, as if by a wild beast. You said it yourself, Lucy. And I found fur on the doorframe of the room where Joy was killed. The fur could have come from a number of animals, Tony pointed out. And even if it is from a werewolf, you can't prove it's Robert. Jessica added. Well, I don't believe in werewolves, Lucy said thoughtfully. But as journalists we do have to consider every possibility. If this alleged werewolf is Robert, and he was wearing the green bathrobe on the night of Joy's murder, then we would, theoretically, find traces of fur on the robe. Fur that matches what you found in the door. Forensic studies should be able to tell us if the fur does come from a wolf, Tony said. If we can find a police investigator who will examine the evidence for us without tipping off Thatcher. I don't know about that, Tony, Lucy said. Perhaps our best course of action now is to go to Thatcher with what we know. It's your call, Lucy, Tony said. But Thatcher must have a lot of loyalty to Pembroke to have gone along with him this long. How do we know he won't bring anything we tell him straight to Pembroke Manor? Lucy frowned. I suppose you're right. But that will complicate our chances of obtaining a forensic study of the evidence. Bumpo, Elizabeth said suddenly. Everyone turned to stare at her. Sergeant Bumpo loves doing forensic studies, and he's been thrilled to have Jessica and me covering his stories. Nobody else ever acted as if they were important. He'll do it if we ask him to. Tony nodded. Good. I doubt a forensic study will prove that the murderer is a werewolf, but it could turn up other clues that could prove young Robert's guilt. He glanced at Jessica. Or innocence, he added quickly. I am glad to see that we're getting more out of your intern assignments than stories about exploding vegetables and murderous kitchen sinks. Lucy raised her eyebrows again. Murderous what? Never mind, Tony said. It's not important. Did Pembroke cite any other evidence for believing that the murderer is a werewolf? Lucy asked. Nothing he said out loud, Elizabeth admitted. But he and Thatcher both seemed convinced on that point. Lucy crossed her arms in front of her and began pacing the living room. As I said, I'm skeptical about this werewolf business. But I knew all along that Lord Pembroke was trying to hide something. I just didn't know what it was. Now thanks to you, Elizabeth, it's clear. The evidence does seem to point to the conclusion that Robert Pembroke, the younger, is a murderer. No way, Jessica protested. I know him better than any of you do. Robert could never kill anybody, and he's not a werewolf. But how else can you explain the threads from his bathrobe found at the scene of Joy's murder? Elizabeth asked. What's so sinister about that? Jessica asked. It's his house after all. Maybe he was in that room the day before. Elizabeth shook her head. I'm sorry if it upsets you, Jess, but you have to face the truth. Robert may be guilty of murder. Your life is in danger, Jessica, Luke warned her. If you hadn't switched beds with Joy, you would have been murdered last weekend at Pembroke Manor. And you said yourself that someone attacked you in the tube station today. Lucy turned to her surprised. Somebody attacked you? Jessica described the incident on the subway platform. Then she scowled at Elizabeth. But it wasn't Robert, she concluded. Robert wouldn't hurt me. Loves me. I bet not one of you has come up with a motive for why he would kill me or those other people. Tony and Lucy exchanged embarrassed glances. I'm afraid you've got us there, Lucy admitted. Except that the murders clearly indicate a psychotic mind at work. Perhaps he doesn't even know he's doing it. I don't know, Jessica. I'm not a psychologist. But the evidence against Robert seems solid enough to warrant an arrest. And perhaps further investigations will reveal a motive. Jessica shook her head. No, they won't. Because he didn't have one. He didn't kill those other people and he didn't try to murder me today. Besides, Robert and I were supposed to spend today together, alone in the country. If he wanted to kill me, that would have been the perfect chance. But he didn't. In fact, he canceled our date at the last minute. Only because he had to leave town before Thatcher arrested him, Luke pointed out. No, no, no. Jessica cried, her voice rising. Wouldn't you leave town if you heard someone was about to arrest you for murders you didn't commit? Elizabeth laid a hand on her sister's shoulder. But Jess, who else but Robert could have been there in the tube station today? Everybody else thought you were out with him. Robert was the only person who knew you'd be alone. You've got to be careful, Jessica. You're in a lot of danger. That was what Robert had said, Jessica remembered suddenly. Promise me you'll be careful. You're wrong about Robert, Jessica insisted. I can't believe that he's any threat to me. But maybe you're right about the rest. Maybe I really am in danger. With a shudder, she remembered the empty tube platform, the sound of heavy panting and the brush of coarse hair against her bare arm. That's quite a painting, David said on Wednesday afternoon at the Church of
Notre-Dame de France, on Leicester Square.
The interior of the chapel was a little dim, so Eliana pulled off the sunglasses she'd become accustomed to wearing almost everywhere. Then she looked up at the cartoon-like mural and smiled warmly when she felt David take her hand. It's a Cocteau, isn't it? Eliana asked. I've always been impressed with the way he combined surrealism with whimsy. David looked at her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. How did you become such an expert, Lena? I wasn't aware that you knew about art. Eliana smiled nonchalantly. Oh, I've picked up a bit. I'm a voracious reader. You know. She chastised herself for not being more careful. Expertise in art history didn't fit in with the image she'd built for herself. Why couldn't she keep her mouth shut? David already suspected that she was hiding something from him. All week she'd been evasive whenever he'd mentioned Liverpool, and she kept slipping up making remarks that were natural from a princess, but inappropriate from a working-class girl of 16. Eliana sighed. The closer she felt to David, the more upsetting it was becoming to continue her charade. That's it, she decided under her breath, still pretending to be engrossed in the mural. Portia has chosen tonight to tell her father the truth about herself. That's when I'll tell David the truth about me. Did you say something? David asked. Eliana blushed. Oh, I was just noticing Judas up there on the mural. What? An odd depiction. David laughed. It certainly is. He looks a bit like the creature from the Black Lagoon. As they left the church a few minutes later, still hand in hand, they passed an unusually crowded newsstand. Must be the evening edition of the London Journal, David said, dropping her hand to move close enough to buy a paper. People seem frightfully excited over it. Eliana held her breath as an inexplicable feeling of dread overwhelmed her. Look at the size of this headline, David said a minute later. Is this a newspaper or a billboard? Listen to this. Is Princess Eliana dead? Honestly, you would think that. Then he held up the newspaper and shook it open. Eliana saw with a sinking heart that an enormous photograph of Princess Eliana gazed serenely from its front page. David's eyes widened and he did a double take. He turned slowly to look at Eliana. Then he examined the photograph again. Luckily, nobody else in the crowd was paying any attention to the two teenagers. Eliana was afraid she was about to burst into tears. She wished fervently that she'd remembered to put her sunglasses back on when they left the church. She was sure that David recognized her. I can't believe this is happening. David, Eliana stammered. But she couldn't bear the look of shock and disappointment on his face. She had lied to him. And the real Lena princess, Eliana, the daughter of the queen, was somebody a boy like David could never fall in love with. Eliana shook her head helplessly, unable to meet his eyes. Then she spun on her heel and fled. Lucy Friday wasn't the easiest person to get along with, Elizabeth decided. She could be brusque and overbearing and was quick to judge people. But from the way Tony was smiling at Lucy, Elizabeth knew he loved her despite her aggressiveness, or maybe because of it. I have to admit, Lucy, he said as he held open the door to the journal office. It's great to have you back at the office, even if it is only for a visit. Elizabeth, Jessica, and Luke passed by Tony through the open door, but Lucy stood outside with her arms folded. Elizabeth suppressed a chuckle. Lucy wanted it to be perfectly clear that she could get along without Tony's help. For opening a door or for anything else. She had been certain that Tony was involved in the cover-up of the murder stories in order to get the job of crime editor for himself. Now at least she seemed to realize that he was as perplexed by the cover-up as she was. Jessica nudged Elizabeth's arm, and Elizabeth realized her sister had been thinking along the same lines. If nothing else, Jessica whispered, at least this crummy murder mystery has brought Lucy and Tony back together again. Elizabeth smiled and nodded, somehow sure that things would work out this time between the two editors. But even more important was Lucy's role in the murder investigation. With an experienced journalist like Lucy helping, Elizabeth was sure they would have a solid case against Robert Pembroke in no time. Elizabeth's hopes on both counts were quickly dashed. When the little group filed into Tony's office, Lucy pounced immediately on the brand new edition of the journal, waiting on Tony's desk. Lucy's beautiful brown eyes filled with suspicion as she read the lead headline. That's 72-point type, she said incredulously, scanning the first few paragraphs of the article. This is total rubbish. Says the body found at Pembroke Manor yesterday morning was the princess. I can't believe Reeves printed that, Tony yelled. He knew it was an unsubstantiated rumor. He was supposed to hold the story until I checked out the details at Pembroke Manor. What was he thinking of? Lucy spun toward him, furious. Don't play innocent with me, Tony Frank. That's your byline, not Reeves's. You knew bloody well that this story was running in tonight's edition. Don't try to blame Reeves. Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. Actually, he didn't know, she said, trying to help. Mr. Reeves had Tony write up the story, but wasn't supposed to run it until. Lucy silenced her with a glance. Save your breath, Elizabeth. I'm sick and tired of hearing people make excuses for this two-faced yellow journalist. You. No, Tony, I used to think you had integrity, but the last couple weeks have shown me that you're the scandalmonger, not Reeves. You're more interested in selling newspapers than you are in printing the truth. And then you have the unmitigated gall to pretend you're on the side of journalistic integrity. But Lucy, that's not, Tony began. Well, I've had it with you, she lashed out. And I've had it with this newspaper. Don't ever call me again. Lucy stalked out the door, slamming it behind her with a crash that rumbled through the office like an earthquake. When the reverberation died away, the room seemed utterly still and empty without her. Well, I guess that's that, Tony said in a thin, quiet voice. She's gone. Chapter 12. Portia stood in the wings a half hour before the curtain was due to go up on Wednesday night's performance of A Common Man. Around her, crew members arranged lights and fumbled with pieces of scenery, while the cast hurried about in various stages of dress. Portia, already in costume, stood apart from the others. She pounced on Jessica as soon as the American girl returned to the backstage area. Did you see my parents out there? She asked. Did they come? I saw them all right, Jessica said. They're out in the lobby where all the ticket holders are milling around waiting for the play to start. Portia sighed thankfully. I was frightfully worried that they wouldn't show. I could have found your folks even without the photo you showed me, Jessica said. Jeepers, Mrs. Bates wasn't kidding when she said your father was famous. Everybody in the place was hounding him for his autograph. All I had to do was follow the crowd. Thanks again for coming along to provide moral support tonight, Portia said. Then she smiled conspiratorially. Not to mention spying services. No problem. I love the theater, especially from this side of the stage. Besides, I was desperate to get away from my overprotective sister. Elizabeth has become a real pain in the neck. But doesn't she have some cause to worry? Portia asked. She told me someone attacked you in the subway today. Do you have any idea who it was? Didn't sound like a simple mugging. Jessica shook her head. I don't know who it was, she said. But you're right. It wasn't a simple mugging. She sighed. It's too long a story to go into. Now, Portia. Besides, I really don't want to think about it. She smiled mischievously. And I'm surprised you haven't asked what I heard your father talking about in the lobby a few minutes ago. Portia stiffened. I didn't realize you were close enough to hear anything. What did he say, Jessica? He hasn't figured out that Penelope Abbott is really me, has he? No, I'm sure he hasn't, Jessica said. Then she turned to watch as a tall, well-muscled young actor strutted by, wearing only the bottom half of his costume. Portia gritted her teeth with impatience. Jessica, what did my father say? She screeched. Jessica grinned. Sorry. I heard your father say he's heard a lot about this Penelope Abbott. He was glad to receive the tickets to come see her in action tonight. He has no idea who sent them, but that didn't seem to bother him. It wouldn't, Portia explained. Theater people send him tickets to plays all the time. They're always anxious for his opinion on actors or directors or scripts. They're not the only ones who are anxious, Jessica said, taking in her nervous eyes and tense posture. Relax, Portia. He'll love your performance. But what if he doesn't? Portia asked. He will, Jessica said confidently. What an exciting profession, she exclaimed, looking as if she were drinking in the backstage atmosphere. I always wanted to act. You know, I was Lady Macbeth in a production this year. And before that, I was in Splendor in the Grass. Everyone said I had a lot of talent. Portia's thoughts wandered from the American girl's words. She was sure Jessica could be a terrific actress if she ever settled down long enough to apply herself to one thing. But that didn't sound like Jessica. Making a career out of acting takes constant work, constant attention. You have to devote your whole life to the craft. But that was all Portia had ever wanted. Except for her father's blessing. When she first left home, Portia had convinced herself that she didn't need his permission to follow her dream. But she knew now that she would never be completely happy as an actress unless she had his approval. I just hope he likes my performance tonight, she whispered desperately, interrupting Jessica's cheerful chatter. He just has to. Elizabeth finished her narration of the day's events Wednesday night and sat down on her bed, watching to see Eliana's reaction. Your evidence sounds quite convincing, Eliana said, a startled look on her face, especially the conversation you overheard between Lord Pembroke and the chief of police. But Robert Pembroke, a serial killer. Even his father admits that the evidence points to him, Elizabeth said. Of course he's in denial about it. He doesn't want to believe that his son has committed such horrible acts. She shuddered, remembering the blood-soaked sheets on Joy Singleton's bed. We'll have more details in the morning, Elizabeth continued. I stopped by Scotland Yard this evening and dropped off the animal fur, the silk threads, and the green bathrobe with Sergeant Bumpo. He's happy to have an excuse to use his high-tech analysis lab. He'll call me tomorrow with the results. And have you figured out who the Annabelle person is? Eliana asked. No. But she obviously loved Pembroke a long time ago. Pembroke said she knew about the secret room years ago. I was going to talk to Luke about her today, to see if he could speculate on her identity, but I forgot to mention it to him. I don't know how I could have been so wrong about Robert, Eliana said. He and I have never been friends exactly, but I have known him all my life. He's always seemed a bit wild, but never dangerous. The worst part about it is that I can't convince my sister that Robert's trying to kill her. She refuses to believe that he's really a werewolf. Actually, Liz, I'm with Jessica on that point, Eliana said. Nothing you say can make me believe in werewolves, although I know that Lord Pembroke has been quite fascinated by them for many years. Apparently he's even persuaded Thatcher that the murderer is a werewolf. After what happened in the tube station today, Elizabeth said, even Jessica is willing to admit that werewolves exist. But she's still sure that Robert is innocent. Eliana, I'm worried about her. Robert has killed 4 people. Jessica is in terrible danger until he's safely in custody. Where is Jessica tonight? Eliana asked. Elizabeth sighed. She went to the theater with Portia. I suppose she'll be all right in a public place like that. I made her promise she wouldn't go anywhere alone. Still, I wish she were here tonight, safe and sound in her upper bunk. Speaking of going out, Eliana, why are you sitting around here with me tonight? I thought you were spending this evening with David. Eliana shook her head and tried, unsuccessfully, to blink back her tears. Not anymore, she said. And probably never again now that he knows the truth about me. Elizabeth gasped. Oh, Eliana, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were going to tell him this afternoon. I wasn't, Eliana said. I didn't. I had decided to tell him tonight. But then that newspaper of yours came out with my photograph plastered across its front page. David picked it up as I was standing right there next to him and he couldn't help but notice the resemblance. Elizabeth finished for her.
I'm sorry, Eliana.
I was hoping he would take the news better than that. What did he say when he realized you're a princess? I don't know. I didn't tarry long enough to hear his reaction. She bit her lip. Ah, Liz, I feel so foolish. Running away was fun for a while, but it didn't accomplish anything except bring grief to my family and David, and provide an excuse for Lord Pembroke to push the spate of mysterious deaths off of page 1 of the journal. You can't blame yourself for Pembroke's actions, Elizabeth assured her. And if David really loves you, your family's royal status shouldn't matter to him. Eliana shook her head. Even if the fact that I'm a princess doesn't make any difference to David, she said, the fact that I hid it from him will. As much as I love him, it's over. David will probably never speak to me again. I just wish there was some way I could make it up to him. Maybe there is, Elizabeth said thoughtfully. You can't go on hiding forever. Sooner or later, you're going to have to come forward. It has to be sooner, Eliana realized with a sigh. If I come out of hiding now, at least something good can come out of all this. We can prove that Pembroke was trying to cover up the stories about the murder and get people to focus their attention on the real news story in London, the fact that 4 people have died horribly. Eliana jumped off the bed and stood in the center of the room for a moment before coming to a decision. Liz, I'm going to turn myself in. Elizabeth grinned. No, you aren't, she said. David is going to turn you in. I don't understand, Eliana began. Then her eyes widened. Oh yes, I do understand. If David is the one to turn me in, then he'll get the £1 million of prize money that the newspaper has put up. With that, he can endow the clinic he wants to start at the homeless shelter and send himself to medical school so he can work in it. Elizabeth, you're a genius. After what I've done to him, I don't expect that David will ever love me again. But this way, I'll feel as if I've done something to compensate for the ghastly way I've treated him. Suddenly, the door burst open, and David himself walked in. He stopped, flustered, when he realized Eliana was standing in the center of the room as if she'd been expecting him. Elizabeth realized David hadn't seen her at all, as she sat on the lower bunk bed in the corner of the room. She opened her mouth to announce her presence, but David began speaking before she had the chance. Lena, or should I say Eliana, he stammered, beginning a speech that had obviously been rehearsed. I loved you as a pauper. I'll love you just as much as a princess if you'll have me. Eliana's smile lit the room, and Elizabeth thought she looked as radiant as a princess should. I will, David, she answered, smiling shyly. Under one condition. Jessica stood backstage, listening to the echoes of the biggest standing ovation she'd ever heard and imagining that she, rather than Portia, was the object of everyone's admiration. But Portia certainly deserved the applause. Her performance as Isabel Huntington that night had been remarkable. After the curtain came down, Portia tackled her with a bear hug. I'm so excited, Jessica. The entire cast was absolutely perfect tonight. Then her face fell. But he's not back here, Jessica. The other cast members' families have made it backstage, but I don't see my father anywhere. He would come to see me if he liked my performance. He must have hated it. Whoa, Portia, Jessica said. I've never seen you so keyed up. Give him a chance. The final curtain just came down. At this very moment he's probably shoving his way through hordes of autograph seekers to get to you. A pretty waif-like actress tapped Portia on the shoulder. Jessica recognized her as Adrian Ronnie, who'd had a small part in the play. Did you hear the news, Penelope? You'll never guess who was in the audience tonight, sir. Montfort Albert, the Shakespearean actor. Portia managed a weak smile. Oh really? He's been my absolute favorite actor for years, Adrian confided. Suddenly, her mouth dropped open and she pointed across the room. Oh Penelope, he's here. Montfort Albert has come backstage. I'm going closer to see if someone will introduce me to him. She scurried off, leaving Jessica and Portia staring across the cluttered space to the tall, distinguished actor who was scanning the room. Suddenly he saw the person he was searching for. When his eyes locked with Portia's, Jessica felt as if an electric current passed between the two. The other actors must have noticed it too. The room fell silent. As he moved across the floor, the cast parted before him like the Red Sea. Then Sir Montfort Albert wrapped Portia in a huge bear hug, while the other actors looked on astonished. Jessica was the only one close enough to hear his whispered apology. I am so proud of you, darling, he said. Can you ever forgive me for the beastly way I've treated you? Portia nodded eagerly, tears sparkling in her eyes. Way to go, Penelope, yelled an enthusiastic young cast member. At the mention of Portia's alias, Sir Albert looked up, realization dawning in his eyes. I think I understand what you've done, Portia, he said in a low voice. And I know why you did it. But it won't be necessary anymore. When he turned to the crowd, Sir Montfort Albert was beaming. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced grandly, I'd like to introduce Portia Albert, my daughter, the actress. Lord Robert Pembroke was pacing again. It was 8 steps across the gleaming parquet floor of his study at Pembroke Green and 8 steps back. He had been fighting a wave of panic all day ever since his telephone conversation with Robert that morning, when he urged his son to flee. He'd been unable to sit still since then, unable to eat or work or even to read his own newspaper. He'd made the trip into London, and locked himself in this infernal room where he had reviewed the evidence over and over again, trying to find a flaw in the story it told. Now he was pacing. He hated this room. In fact, he hated the entire house. Pembroke Green was his wife's domain. City living had never appealed to Lord Pembroke. He much preferred the open countryside. On his ancestral land at Pembroke Manor he had a feeling of stability of his place in time's continuum. But now that continuum was about to come to a screeching, skidding, sickening halt right at the foot of his heir and only son, Robert. He consulted his watch for the 3rd time in the last 2 minutes. His stomach lurched. It was exactly 10 o'clock. Somewhere in the distance the doorbell rang. The sound was muted, but Pembroke's anxiety and the room's stillness magnified it into a harsh jangling. He pulled out a linen handkerchief and mopped the sweat that was running in rivulets down his face. Confound you, Andrew, he said when Thatcher walked into the room a minute later. Right on time, aren't you? You're like a vulture diving in for the kill. An interesting choice of analogy, Robert, said the chief of police. You have information for me, I presume. Pembroke stared at him wildly. I'll tell you what the evidence reveals. Though I still don't believe it myself. But you must promise me that you won't release it to the media just yet. Thatcher pounded his fist on the desk. I'm not making any promises this time. Until I see the evidence, investigate it and question the suspect. Don't you understand, Robert? For people have been murdered. If I had followed my conscience after Joy's murder. He stopped, shaking his head sadly. If I hadn't listened to you then, the police chief continued in a soft voice, not looking at Pembroke, Maria Finch might still be alive today. No matter what the evidence says, Robert, her blood is also on my hands and yours. Thatcher turned to the older man, and Pembroke saw that his handsome face was hard, his mouth set in a grim line. Now, Robert, are you going to tell me what you know? The 2 men stared at each other for a full minute, but it seemed like an hour to Pembroke. Finally he lowered his eyes, defeated. Then he reached for the top drawer of his desk, where he'd lovingly placed a handful of green threads, a clump of fur and a silver cigarette case.